Thomas S. spent every Saturday morning in the city clerk's office reading any official document he could find. He was proud to call himself a junior archivist. Whenever he entered the room of records, excitement flickered in his chest. The room smelled like mold and old wood, and its tall ceilings provided a sense of majesty and holiness. Antique file cabinets towered towards the ceiling, placed one by one like dominoes, ordered alphabetically. 2 years ago, Thomas had started on the A section. He read through every A announcement from 1888 to the current year, 1936, through birth records, and finally he had arrived at the C section. Today he found himself reading the Charter of the Village. Thomas placed the charter on the long wooden reading table situated on the western side of the room. It was made of hard wood and was not unlike a table a king would sit at with his subjects. But today, like every day, Thomas was its sole visitor. Thomas had a specific purpose. He aimed to discover what went wrong with the city. The town suffered racial divide in the late 1880s that progressed so violently that there were now separate drinking fountains depending on what color fabric you were legally obligated to wear on the basis of income. Twins could not attend school, and anyone with a name starting in the letter D had to spend 3 years in the town militia, which was notorious for malnutrition and abuse. Under the weak 30-watt glow of a banker's lamp, Thomas pored over the document, making notes in pencil on a legal pad as he read. He had become fluent in the antiquated dialect of the 1800s and read with confidence. As Thomas read, he felt an intense sadness. The charter accounted for and allowed segregation by race. Amendments authorized the division of twins from society, and special executive orders set a rubric for maximum prison sentences for anything a court could deem unladylike. He read for hours, reading decree after decree, feeling smaller and smaller. A handful of well-meaning men and women had legally objected to such policies and attempted to repeal them in court. However, the town was content, and a jury of even their most liberal peers refused the reversal and in turn agreed to impose punishments for wasting the court's time and money. Several of the instigators had to paint their fingernails with pig shit every morning, and special police checked to make sure they adhered to the sentence. Others, more troublingly, had to use the bathroom in their pants. If they were seen without spoiled trousers or skirts, they had to go door to door to the neighbors and tell the neighbors, the charter quoted, "I am waste, and you may feed me your waste." The townspeople were more than happy to comply, and some low individuals even kept brimming chamber pots on hand. Thomas read the entire charter, all 96 pages, twice. It was a list of baffling commandments, with no recourse to overturn them. He felt heavy with disappointment, until he found an allowance on page 81 concerning anyone who no longer wanted to live in the town. It read,
"Citizens are not allowed to leave the town. However, if you object to these laws approved so humbly by our fine citizens, you may formally request to be eaten alive on public land by any citizen or citizens who wish to participate."
Eureka! Thomas was overcome with joy and excitement. For the past 2 years, he had been searching for a way to overturn unreasonable laws, or, at the very least, find a way to escape. He made several photocopies of the entire charter and headed home to scheme. The next morning, Thomas waited patiently with an arm full of documents in front of the city hall. An old security guard unlocked the front doors at precisely 9 a.m., and Thomas confidently marched into the judge's chambers. He knocked on the judge's heavy mahogany doors, and they swung open, revealing the geriatric judge. The judge carefully read the charter, sometimes dozing off, only to return exactly where he'd left off. Thomas waited patiently, grinning with satisfaction and anticipation, and after several hours, the judge wheezed a heavy sigh and rested his chin on his fist.
In my 71 years as a judge, I haven't once been mindful of this law.
He rasped emotionlessly.
I'm disappointed.
Thomas felt the pangs of defeat in his chest.
Disappointed?
He asked.
Disappointed because of all the wasted time. So many citizens could have happily been eaten had I read with more care. Of course, I'm happy to grant you your right to be devoured alive. This city thrives on its laws, and to deny you this right would be unjust. So shall we set a date?
He said with a flicker in his eye. The judge called his secretary into the office, and the three found a suitable time. He ordered the secretary to return the charter to the clerk's office, and she happily obeyed his demand. Throughout the town, young men stapled posters to telephone poles and brushed them with a weather-resistant lacquer. As word spread throughout the town, the declaration met a divisive fury. One camp of people argued the law was antiquated and obsolete, a remnant of ancient times and no longer applicable to society. Others argued it was Thomas's inherent right, and bureaucratic institutions had no right to interfere. A messenger boy delivered an official correspondence from the city council just 2 days before the feast. Debate had roared so intensely that the judge ordered the declaration to go to the city council. Thomas felt anxious, but confident the law would win the day. Opposing parties filled the school cafeteria turned court on separate sides, seated uncomfortably in folding chairs. The declaration was read, arguments were heard, and the council retreated to the cafeteria's kitchen to debate. The audience sat in respectful silence, brimming with pleasure, witnessing democracy take place in real time. Each side was confident they would succeed, and surprisingly, no outbursts arose other than a few sneezes, coughs, and flatulence from the elderly in the crowd who no longer had total control of their bowels. After 49 minutes of debate, the council returned to their respective places in the front of the cafeteria. The city manager, an overweight, red-faced woman named Rhonda Perkins, who seemed perpetually out of breath, read the declaration.
We, the city's democratically elected council, rule in favor of Thomas S. The town charter grants his request without prejudice. The meeting is adjourned.
Both sides of the aisle clapped, although the opponents still felt deflated. The winners took pride in Thomas's upheld right, and the losers accepted the solemn letter of the law. The two camps filed out of the auditorium with no animosity and enjoyed a pancake breakfast in the local Lutheran church. Thomas received word within minutes that the devouring was still on. He jumped in the air with glee, and a number of townspeople could be heard screaming, "Yippee!" He heard this from his porch. Thomas left his house at dawn the following day to enjoy one last walk around the city. Squirrel nests marked leafless trees that shriveled in the cold fall weather. Thomas reveled in the majesty of the church and genuflected at the altar, despite being an irreligious man. He left the church feeling cleansed and content. When Thomas returned to Main Street, he nearly fainted in shock. The clerk's office was ablaze, flames towering stories over its collapsing roof. He ran to the blaze, pulling out his hair and gnashing his teeth. Surely the opponents of the resolution would argue that the destruction of the document meant that there was no longer a document to enforce. As he staggered backwards, he read a crudely scrawled message on the pavement in sidewalk chalk. It read, "This is not progress." Thomas sprinted to the judge's office and waited for the old security guard to open the door as the volunteer fire brigade doused the still raging fire. He was let in and hustled to the judge's chambers. The judge was equally concerned and sat in silence for an hour as Thomas waited anxiously. He didn't move and dozed on and off as he thought. Finally, the judge broke the silence and turned to Thomas.
If we revoke this law, all city laws can in turn be revoked. We are in a pickle indeed.
Thomas sat, crestfallen. He held his face in his hands with his elbows on his knees as he scrambled for a solution. Then he remembered. He had made copies of the charter, and they were stored safely in his house.
"I'll be back in exactly 1 jiffy,"
he exclaimed to the judge. He ran home without stopping, took the photocopied documents from his house, and sprinted back to the judge's chambers, where the judge was lightly napping. He cleared his throat, and the judge snapped awake. Thomas gleefully placed the documents on the judge's desk.
"It's all accounted for,"
he exclaimed. The judge smiled broadly.
In order for this to be an official document,
the judge explained,
it must be handwritten and stamped by the town notary to be accepted as a replacement, then confirmed by the city council. I'll have the secretary call the council and the notary. You get writing,
he said with a wink. Thomas sat on the bench outside the chambers, painstakingly copying each word, careful not to make any spelling errors or omissions. While he wrote, the council was gathered and the notary was called to duty. The council held an ad hoc meeting, read the transcript, and carefully compared it to the photocopy, signed off on it, and the notary stamped it. An announcement was made throughout the city that the devouring was on and the charter reinstated. Residents cheered on both sides, happy that the official processes had prevailed. The few radical citizens responsible for the arson were sentenced to a lifetime of shitting their pants. The following Saturday at 3 p.m., Thomas stood naked and proud on a wooden platform carefully constructed by the town's very best carpenters. His arms and legs were tied to a post with a heavy knot, not to stop Thomas from escaping, but to hold him in place when the feast began. The supporting and the opposing parties filed in line, bending around the city block as they waited their turn. The supporting party was excited to eat him, to support their cause. The opposing party respectfully showed up to responsibly take part in the democratic process, as was their duty. With the crowd gathered and Thomas ready, the mayor took to the stage with an official sash across his breast, reading, simply, Mayor. It was largely a ceremonial role, and the overweight man relished in his pseudo-authority.
"It is with great pleasure and great respect that I introduce the first ever devouring of a citizen by choice. Thomas, say the words and the feast will begin."
Thomas beamed and took a deep breath.
"You may eat me,"
he declared. The crowd let out an uproarious cheer, and one by one, people took the stage. The first bites were taken cautiously, like reverent bites of a Eucharist. They barely broke the skin and released very little flesh. However, as the day went on, bigger chunks were taken out. The town baker took a giant chunk out of Thomas's leg meat. Thomas winced and smiled. The Lutheran pastor bit from Thomas's side, breaking a major capillary that bled throughout the process. The high school class president devoured most of Thomas's bicep, and the president of the PTA smiled broadly to the crowd as she ripped a part of Thomas's cheek clean off. Piece by piece, Thomas was eaten. The town was ecstatic, and Thomas was proud he could be a beacon of democracy and progress. By 7 p.m., he had completely withered, leaving only a pile of bones and ropes that had been gnawed clean through. Within weeks, the city council decreed a monument of Thomas was to be built. The town's very best masons got to work and erected the statue in front of the elementary school. Forever, Thomas would be memorialized as he stood naked in granite, with birds shitting on his shoulders, a true monument to democracy.
The